I like to say, quite long ago, my forebears extended a hand of friendship to people of Europe when they came to that continent. What has happened to the extension of that hand, only history can say.
There is a saying that goes to the heart of traditional Zulu culture.
Kuhlonishwana, kabili.
Respect is mutual. When one person shows respect to another, that respect must be reciprocated.
It was an amazing thing to see such a huge crowd of Zulu people as had come to honour one very old man. I mean, my grandfather was well in his 80s when he died. One would have thought that they might have forgotten him. Some of them had walked for hundreds of miles to be with us. And I remember Auntie Jane ordering oxen to be slaughtered and the people to be fed. And then she said to her induna that he must explain to them that we would hire buses to take them to Mountain Rise Cemetery for the ceremony. And they refused that offer. They said, he marched for us, we will march for him. And I found that incredibly moving. And they started walking before sunrise, so that by the time we got to the cemetery, the whole hillside was covered with people standing quietly. And only when Grandad was buried did Pega Godinzulu come forward. And he was dressed in his marvellous leopard skins. He looked wonderful to sing Grandad's praises and to speak at length about him. We appreciated that enormously.
The history of the Zulu kingdom, the place where the Zulu came from, and the history of Natal, the colony of Natal, are linked. The Zulu kingdom was too independent and it was too strong. It didn't fit with the plans which were just beginning to evolve about South Africa at the time. In 1879, there were 2 Boer republics. There were 3 colonies. There were a number of independent African states. And diamonds had been discovered in the interior. And the British hatched a plan to combine these various states. And to do that, they had to get rid of the most powerful and the most independent. In 1877, they annexed the Transvaal. And in 1879, they attacked the Zulu kingdom without, in my opinion, any basis to the justification pretexts which were used.
But the colonizers seriously underestimated the resolve of the Zulu nation. In the invasion, the British military suffered their greatest defeat of the 19th century at Ishindwana.
And the British were left floundering in Zululand. Zulu King, Kashwai Kampani, didn't attack when he could have. He could have invaded neighboring Natal. He didn't do so. He tried to negotiate a peace. This gave the British the chance to remobilize, bring in reinforcements, and attack again.
This time, the spears and assegais of the Zulu warriors were no match for the 23,000 heavily reinforced British troops, backed up by Gatling guns and cannons. The Zulu self-defense was brave but suicidal, and Ulundi, the royal homestead, was burned to the ground. King Ketshwai Mpanda was banished into exile. The once powerful Zulu nation now subjugated, the British implemented their divide and rule policy and carved the kingdom into 13 chiefdoms.
I remember as a tiny girl crawling onto his lap. He was sitting on a rug on the Kikuyu lawn outside the farmhouse and just cuddling up against him. And whenever we did that, he used to take out his beautiful pocket watch and let us listen to it and play with it and open all its little glass lenses. And he used to make it chime for us. He loved us to come and spend almost every holiday at his farm. And even when the war was on and transport was difficult, Grandad used to send tickets for us to come at least once a year to spend a holiday on the farm. And so we all grew up a lot in his home and on his farm, and we enjoyed that very much. He used to do a lot of the farming himself. He was always up in time for the milking and going over the cattle, seeing that none of them had been in any way harmed or hurt, and dosing those that were ill.
After the invasion, that's the end of 1879, beginning of 1880, delegations of Usuthu, Zulu, the great men of the kingdom, came down to Pietermaritzburg to try and appeal to the Natal authorities for some restoration of their property. They were dismissed. They then went to a man that they knew who supported them and his family, the famous John Colenso, Bishop of Natal. He listened to them. He was already outraged about what had happened in the war. He began a political agitation, finding allies amongst humanitarian groups in London, and began to work for the Usuthu, for the Royalists.
I always say that for me and my family, the Zulu royal family, I would say that the reason why we didn't become racist was because of Bishop Colenso and her daughters, who actually in those days accepted us as human beings and fought many battles for the Zulu cause.
Bishop Colenso's efforts were successful, and King Cetshwayo was returned from exile to Zululand. But the actions of the British in dividing up the kingdom had already precipitated a full-scale civil war between the 13 rival chiefs. Some 10,000 people perished in that war. And then one night in July 1883, Chief Zabebu Kamapita attacked the sleeping royal homestead of Ulundi. King Cetshwayo miraculously escaped, but the elders, the Iskulu, the great men of the kingdom were all murdered.
If there's one event which ended the Zulu kingdom, it's the attack on Ulundi in 1883. The British attack in July 1879 is of course crucial to it, but there was no chance of recovery after the attack by Zabebu in 1883.
He used to say, "What are you learning in your history, dear?" And I'd say, "Well, Grandad, they're teaching us about the great trek." And we were reading in our history book how very treacherous the Zulu king had been. And Grandad said to me, "You do know, of course, that the white settlers were coming to steal their land, and that they had also had plenty of experience with the white settlers along the coast, in other words, the British settlers."
John Sydney Marwick was born in the small village of Richmond in the colony of Natal on the 17th of August 1874. He was the third son, one of 10 children born to Thomas and Elizabeth Marwick. 3 of his siblings died in infancy. His parents were Burn settlers who immigrated from Scotland in 1850. Richmond in the 1800s was a serene village centred on the church of St. Mary's. Built of stone in 1853, St. Mary's was the first Anglican church in Natal and was consecrated by the legendary Bishop Colenso. As early as 1852, the young men played cricket, and the Richmond Lawn Tennis Club was founded in 1876. John Sydney Marwick, his brothers and sisters, all went to school in Richmond, where he excelled at running. Known to all as Sid, J.S. Marwick did well academically, achieving an aggregate of 87% in his school-leaving examination at age 14 in 1888. Growing up in Natal, Marwick learnt to speak fluent Zulu. In 1893, Sid Marwick and his younger brother Rob were appointed as clerks to the Secretary of Native Affairs office in Pietermaritzburg. 2 years later, having passed the necessary examinations, they were sworn in as Zulu interpreters and translators in the Supreme Court.
He and his brother Rob, they weren't sure as very young men whether their Zulu was fluent enough to become interpreters. So they waited until there was no moon at the side of the road in Maritzburg, and they heard a group of young Zulu men coming along who said they were walking to Richmond. And Grandad and Uncle Rob said, could they join the group? And so they marched together all night long, telling stories, laughing, singing. And then when the sun started coming up, there was a sort of horrified exclamation, "Abalongo."
In October 1895, Sydney Marwick was transferred to the mining town of Johannesburg, and by 1897, he was the first fully fledged native agent for the Natal government in the Transvaal. With his offices at 61 Marshall Street, his job was to care for the well-being of thousands of Zulu labourers coming to the goldfields to earn cash wages needed to pay for, amongst other things, hut tax. Hut tax was the system of taxation imposed on the Zulu kingdom from as early as 1849 by Administrator for the British government, Theophilus Shepstone.
Natal, from the very beginning, was under extreme pressure to be economically viable. There were no resources, really. There certainly were no export resources, and it had to pay its own way.
Of course, the intention of imposing those taxes was actually they were looking for labor. And therefore, they knew that when these taxes were imposed, that the Zulu people would have to go look for jobs in order to pay the tax.
At first, it was white farms and the construction of railways that needed labour. But in 1886, with the discovery of gold, there were much higher wages to be earned on the goldfields and in the city of Johannesburg.
Bokufuywa kona kakhulu kuloko nje iloko engaqoqela ngako ukuthi babephuma babatshele emakhaya ukuthi sisayo funa kwakuthiwa imali lekudala uNtsumbulwane uyayizwa imali kuthiwa uNtsumbulwane wabasho ubotiki lokho khona ubotiki wozuka bohleli bekuhamba abuye eqala lo mdala ngoba ngokwesikhathi ekhaya akakho umntwana omkhulu umfana osomdala manje kubantu besifazane bashiye emndenini ukuthi le mndeni lewe thaleni ngibhekela la ngisahamba sokuzawuphuma ke manje sathi sebathi ke labafana abadala baba sicela ukuthi usale uma wena sowuzophuma thina wena sowuzogada inkomo leka bese yabasheni Nkosi ukuthi kulungile ke ba senifuna ukuhamba nina senibona senikhulile hambani mbohamba kodwa ningaduki ekhaya.
Marwick, his job is also to see to injured workers. He looks into fraud, he looks into squabbles amongst miners, besides the fact that he wants them to send their money home so that they can support the families who sent them and the clans who sent them to earn money.
Iqale nje impela bekuzinyawo bathathe umthwalo le bayibophe emahlombe bangena indlela besenene mabeza nene wangabe bahalalele lapho amalanga amahle kwesikhathi uhamba amalanga amahlanu.
I read about a group of 12 that obviously had no clothes. They come from the tropical coast. They land in the Drakensberg, they freeze, and maybe one person who was in the middle of the huddle would survive. And then, I mean, it's wild animals, it's farmers who refuse them passage or charge them money to come across, walk across their farms, or, you know, highwaymen and robberies.
Ufuna ukuthi ahlome induku la azolala la azokwazi ukuthi uma evuka la uvuka uyali Uba mangahlomanga induku kwesikhathi uzobheka le. Kwesikhathi ashonele. Kwesikhathi ashonele manje uyalahleka la. Hambe kazaze ufike eGoli kathola umsebenzi ke bese kuyasetshenzwa. Butho le mali ke kubuya kakhulukazi into ababevama ukuyithenga.
On the mines, Zulu labourers worked mainly above ground, sorting ore that came from below, selecting out the gold-bearing rock. They also found employment in white homes as grooms or as kitchen and household domestics. Others worked as watchmen and guards, as well as sanitary workers for the municipality. There were also a large group of Zulu men that took in laundry, known as the amawasha. With 1899 came rumours of war. As the year progressed, a steady stream of Johannesburg residents left for the safety of Natal and the Cape, many leaving behind their domestic workers to take care of their properties.
A lot of the Uitlanders, who were the British and other nationalities, miners and shopkeepers and businessmen, were shutting up shop, closing their houses, and then going down to Natal and to the Cape to sit out this crisis.
Bloemfontein, 31st of May. President Paul Kruger and British High Commissioner Sir Alfred Milner meet around this table in a final attempt to resolve their differences. By the 5th of June, the Bloemfontein Conference has failed, and war seems inevitable. Come September, panic has set in, with refugees crowding Park Station, snapping up every available option to flee the looming conflict.
The mines started closing down and just dismissing their compounds full of workers. Marwick obviously sees what's happening. Now he sits with a growing number, almost 20,000 Zulus that he now needs to get out of the situation. Because war is coming, food is drying up, they're going to starve.
On horseback to Pretoria, Marwick meets with Republic Commandant General Joubert and manages to secure railway passes for his workers, giving them authorized passage back home to Natal by train. Over the next few days, thousands of Zulu workers swell the flock of refugees and manage to get out on crowded trains. But on the 2nd of October, that door is closed. All rail passenger traffic to Natal is suspended as the railways are officially commandeered by the Boers, preparing for the coming war. With some 7,000 Zulu workers left stranded on the Rand, for John Sydney Marwick there is only one option: they must walk. It's a journey of some 490 kilometers over the Drakensberg Mountains to their homes in rural Natal. But for Marwick, the first pressing objective is to escape the looming conflict and get the 7,000 across the ZAR-Natal border some 241 kilometers away at the frontier town of Volksrust.
Interestingly enough, never talked about the march to us. His sisters often talked about the march because they felt it was a very great achievement. But I think that Grandad tended to live in the present.
Back to Pretoria. But when Marwick arrives, General Joubert has already left for Sunspruit, where the Boer army is massing, preparing for the imminent invasion of Natal. Joubert's secretary, Louis de Souza, is highly skeptical of Marwick's plans. With the Boer army between Marwick and Natal, his planned march leading some 7,000 Zulus is a recipe for disaster. But Marwick insists and convinces de Souza to telegram Joubert at Sunspruit. Commandant Joubert, showing great understanding of Marwick's predicament, authorizes the safe passage on the strict condition that Marwick is personally responsible for the peaceful and orderly conduct of the 7,000 Zulus marching unarmed directly to the Natal border. Convincing his employers in Natal proves more difficult. They want nothing to do with Marwick's planned evacuation. But Marwick is resolute. The lives of his workers are at stake. As a last resort, so as not to embarrass the Natal authorities, Marwick offers to resign with the proviso that should he succeed in getting the 7,000 safely home, the Natal government are welcome to consider his re-employment. Reluctantly, the colonial authorities finally give Marwick their sanction. on the strict condition that he keep expenses to an absolute minimum. Messengers are sent out notifying the Zulu workers of the planned walk. On the 4th of October 1899, Marwick addresses a crowd of thousands outside his offices in Marshall Street. In fluent Zulu, he tells them that the government has granted permission for them to march with him to the Natal border under the escort of 6 mounted police. So as not to be robbed, he urges those that have not already done so to bank their wages at the office. They should bring only enough food and money for 5 days. Marshals are appointed to keep order on the planned march. It's a massive feat of administration and organization. In the final 3 days, Marwick channels some £10,000 in wages back to Natal. Finally, on Friday the 6th of October 1899, John Sydney Marwick, accompanied by his 2 colleagues, Wheelwright and Connaughton, marshals and 6 mounted police escorts, sets out from the agricultural showgrounds in Johannesburg for Natal. It's an epic journey, some 490 kilometers to the Natal border. Consolidated at around 7,000, including a number of women and children, on Saturday the 7th of October, having covered some 56 kilometers, they spend a cold, windy night in the rocky hills overlooking the town of Heidelberg. The next morning at Heidelberg Station, Marwick negotiates to get some 70 ailing men and 5 women and children onto a chance-packed train heading for Natal. Nearby, in the shadow of the iconic stone church, the mood is somber as the Heidelberg commando prepares to leave for the front. It will be a terrible war, with dire consequences for all. In just 3 years, graves of women and children, victims of concentration camps, will mark the landscape not far from the current resting place of the 7,000. The Heidelberg Commando will be one of the last to surrender, a final miscarriage of justice seeing the execution by British firing squad of one of its officers, Veldkornet Selman van As. Well stocked with food and provisions bought from Heidelberg shopkeepers and surrounding farmers, the 7,000 set off for Standerton, some 120 kilometers further on. Tuesday, 10th of October, the 4th day on the march, sees the 7,000 passing through the small siding of Waterval. For the Boers, it's a big day, the birthday of President of the Republic, Paul Kruger. In celebration, some 100 kilometers up ahead, between Marwick and the Natal border, the Boer forces are mustering under Commandant General Joubert at Sandspruit. With an army of some 8,500 men, over 5,000 horses, 400 wagons, 2,000 oxen, and 1.5 tons of stores, the Boers are ready for war. An official ultimatum has been sent to the British, giving them 24 hours' notice in which to withdraw their troops from the borders of the Republic, failing which there will be war. Wednesday, 11th of October, day 5. With the ultimatum expiring at 5 p.m., it's the final countdown. By noon, at Standerton Station, Marwick manages to get another 150 sick men onto a train heading for the Natal border. For the rest, a looming encounter with Boer forces further down the road.
At Standerton, Marwick is fully aware of this problem, that between him and his destination there's a huge army, the biggest mounted force ever brought together until that time in southern Africa.
By midnight, war has been declared, and the 7,000 bed down in the veld on the outskirts of Paardekorp. At dawn, Marwick slaughters a bull. Small pieces are sold to the marchers to complement the rations they bought the day before in Standerton, and they set off for Sandspruit and General Joubert. Riding on ahead, after 5 hours, Marwick arrives with Corporal Williams at Sandspruit, only to find that General Joubert and his army have left for Volksrust. At the station, the mood is hostile, as Marwick now represents the enemy. There's even talk of executing him. Talking his way out of a sticky situation, Marwick succeeds in getting off a telegram to General Joubert at Volksrust, informing him that the marchers are on their way. For both Boer and Zulu, it's a miserable, wretched night on the open veldt under a heavy downpour of rain. The Zulus just outside Sunspruit and the Boers 20 kilometers ahead in the shadow of Volksrust, frontier town on the Natal border. All around them, in the wet darkness, are echoes of past violent conflict and premonition of future suffering to come. The next morning, in Volksrust, Marwick finally meets with Commandant Joubert and informs him that his party of 7,000 is waiting on the outskirts of town.
A huge force of Zulus are going to descend on the town. Any spark will turn that entire commando onto this group of Zulu men and women.
In what must surely be one of the most bizarre moments in history, on the threshold of war, 65-year-old General Joubert, with his wife by his side, takes the salute as 7,000 Zulus, headed by Marwick the Englishman, march past through the frontier town of Volksrust. Friday, 13th of October, their 7th day on the march. Marwick and the 7,000 reach Langsneck, the treacherous mountain pass over the Drakensberg, snaking down below Mount Majuba. It's been raining for 2 days, and ahead of the 7,000 intrepid Zulus, the advance party of the Boer army is already negotiating its artillery battery through the muddy quagmire.
Now they've got to go down the mountain. And it's thick mist. They have the pass's approval of Joubert, but the advance guard of 3,000 Boers are already halfway down the mountain, led by a guy called Trichard.
Trichard is adamant that he will not allow the Zulus to pass his advance column. He insists that the Zulus must wait until the Boers have negotiated their artillery battery down the pass. There is a tense standoff as Marwick impresses upon Trichard the explosive potential posed by the frustration of his 7,000 Zulus, exhausted and on the verge of starvation, treading on the heels of the slow-moving column of 3,000 Boer forces. Raising the temperature even further, while Marwick is busy negotiating, the Boers press gang 400 of his Zulu marchers to drag 2 cannon and 6 wagons of ammunition up the mountain slope, bypassing the muddy quagmire churned up by the throng of oxen, horses and mules moving in the pouring rain down the pass. Eventually, swayed by the opinion of his advisors, Trichard finally relents and gives the order to the commander of the artillery battery to allow Marwick and his 7,000 weary, hungry marchers to pass. For Marwick, it's a watershed moment as he finally gets the 7,000 Zulu marchers ahead of the advancing Boer army. With the invading Boer army behind him and the British forces mustering up ahead, Marwick's priority is now to avoid getting trapped between the two forces and the looming head-on conflict. At Newcastle, the advance guard of the Boer forces, hot on the heels of the 7,000, move in and formally occupy the Natal town. Approaching Danhauser, the first band of roughly 3,000 Zulus break away from the group and safely disperse towards their homes in the region of Ulundi. As they continue, more and more groups break away to make their way to homes in the surrounding rural environment. With the remaining group of around 1,000, at 5 p.m. on Sunday the 15th of October, Marwick arrives at the railway siding of Hattingspruit.
He now goes to the Natal railways and says, I've got 1,000 people, can you put them on the train? They need to go south to Pietermaritzburg, Richmond way. I said, fine, £1 each.
At £1 a ticket, it was blatant exploitation of the weary and vulnerable, demonstrating absolutely no compassion whatsoever on the part of the colonial government and Natal Railways. Too exhausted to argue, the men paid, grateful to secure the final leg of their journey home. Arriving in Pietermaritzburg on Monday morning, the 16th of October, it had taken Marwick and the 7,000 Zulu workers 10 days to accomplish the 490-kilometer journey. In expression of their immense gratitude, the Zulu marchers anoint Marwick Umuhle, meaning the good one.
After such an act of kindness and magnanimity, it was quite appropriate for them to give him the name of the good one, because he had done such a good thing, a good gesture to the Zulu people who wanted to be repatriated back to their homeland.
If you think he's 25 years old, that he, as a young Englishman, got the ZAR powers that be to listen to him, and Joubert was an old man at that time, and that he impressed them enough, I think is a major achievement. And the fact that he kept this entire group together in the way that he did, that they listened to him. But I think he led from the front. When there's a person who needs his horse, he gets off, he walks. So he walked and rode, I think, almost a double march. If you think of how many times he went up and down the ranks, always seeing to his stragglers.
At the time, Sydney Marwick was engaged to Miss Edith Rowe, daughter of the Reverend S. Evans Rowe. After the march, Sydney gives his fiancée this tiny gold ring to commemorate the event. The inscription on the inside reads, Edith from Sydney, October the 7th to October the 16th, 1899. With the outbreak of war, Sydney Marwick did not sign up for active service with the British Army. Instead, he took on the task of setting up the Native Labour Corps. The Corps was a non-combatant unit of black men assembled to support British troops with digging trenches, transport of goods and weapons, and general fatigue duties.
Remember too, he said to me, what are you learning now? And I said, oh, I'm learning about the Second Anglo-Boer War. And he said, oh yes, and what are they telling you? I said, well, they're saying, you know, what an unwelcoming person President Kruger was to the people who'd simply come to mine, and that he wouldn't give them their rights. Grandad said, oh yes, well, I'll tell you what I think of the Anglo-Boer War. I think it was one of the most wicked acts of imperial aggression that Britain was ever guilty of. He said they provoked that war.
A brutal and protracted conflict, the Anglo-Boer War engulfed the Transvaal Republic, Natal, and the Orange Free State from 1899 to 1902. The impact on the Boer civilian population was devastating. So too for the black community who were caught up in between Boer and British forces. Many black workers working for Afrikaners automatically assumed a non-combatant support role as agterrijers to the Boer commandos.
Daar was plaaswerkers gewees en op die dorpe was daar verskeie werkers gewees. En baie van hierdie plaaswerkers was baie loyale burgers van die Vrystaat gewees, van die Transvaal. Omtrent enigiets tussen 10 tot 12.000 agterryers is saam op kommando opgeroep. En hulle was dan verantwoordelik vir verskeie aspekte soos die versorging van die perde, die voorbereiding van voedsel, alles wat logistiek nodig was vir die oorlogspoging.
With Britain's scorched earth policy, Boer farms and homesteads were systematically destroyed, and the Afrikaner women and children herded into concentration camps. Black farmers and their families, as well as black families living and working on Boer farms, suffered the same fate.
The transport of people to the camps was very, very poorly done, with very little in the way of humanitarian consideration, either for the blacks or the Boers. They were allowed to take very little with them, no bedding, for instance, in most cases. When they arrived in the camps, the Boers were housed in threadbare tents, and they had to sleep on the ground for long periods in many cases. Conditions overall in the black camps were very poor. They were worse than in the white camps. There was a lot of disease, there was not enough food, and the food was of a very low quality. They were, in many cases, provided no shelter whatsoever. So when the big epidemics began to spread through the white camps, especially in the second half of 1901, they hit these black camps very, very hard indeed as well. And thousands of people died there.
Some 26,000 Afrikaner women and children perished in British concentration camps. A lesser-known fact, some 25,000 black civilians perished in similar camps set up for blacks. 22,000 British and Allied troops lost their lives, the majority to disease, while some 7,000 Boer commandos were killed in the conflict. But the fallout impacted beyond the appalling death toll. With victory, it was widely anticipated by the black community that the British would ensure equal rights and political dispensation for all.
The black community was expecting to get some political rights after the war, and they were grievously disappointed by this. Milner and some people associated with him decided that the South African imbroglio could be easily solved if you cut the blacks out of the question. And you pacified the Boers, you kept your own constituency of the British people happy, and this is what they did after the war.
In November 1901, Sydney Marwick married his fiancée Edith Rowe, and the newlyweds moved to the Rand, where in 1903 Marwick was appointed Assistant Secretary for Native Affairs, with the newly formed British-run civil service of the Transvaal colony. Post-Boer War Johannesburg was once again a rough, aggressive and lawless mining town. Racism was rife. Blacks were openly treated as second-class citizens, even expected to give way for whites on the city pavements. In this environment, flogging, although not legal, was a common punishment meted out by white bosses to black laborers. In 1905, Marwick had reason to suspect that a commissioner on the East Rand by name of Peterson was abusing his position and meting out racially motivated floggings on a regular basis.
There's a tremendous anxiety in this period around what were called houseboys, the presence of these adult men as domestic servants in the house. There are a whole lot of English-speaking women who are brought out as domestic servants at the same time. So what Peterson is doing is he lets the word out that he will discipline these men. And the particular instance that Marwick investigates very closely is of a man who touches the breast, sweeps his hand across the breast of a white servant in one of these houses. Marwick, obviously seeing the injustice of this thing, begins collecting evidence from other black people who'd been through the Native Commissioner's offices and found that essentially flogging was habitual. It was a normal thing. It was something that Peterson was doing regularly every day. Marwick builds the case. It's very interestingly done, and he collects some of the best evidence that I've ever seen from these African informants. They're all named individually, they all explain who they are. It's very unusual to pick up affidavits like that are clearly written in the language of the people that deposition's been taken from. And he collects a lot of them, and then he compiles all the evidence and essentially basically proves that Peterson is behaving like an old Boer Native Commissioner. And in the end, Peterson writes this really completely pitiful letter in which he says, if I'm basically fired, if I'm dismissed from this post, my wife, my family will all starve. I totally apologize for my behavior. I think it says a lot about Marwick in 1905. What it says is Africans are to be treated as citizens in terms of the law. He's looking for equality in 1905. I think that's important.
In 1905, 600 miles away, in the colony of Natal, it was no different. Here too, racism was rife. Africans were second-class citizens, and their financial security and well-being had been steadily eroded. From 1849, all married African men had been taxed according to their number of wives, via hut tax. Then followed marriage tax and dog tax. In the post-war economy, wages were lower. Africans were increasingly pushed off their land, and forced to pay ever-increasing rents. The settlers too were feeling the effects of the economic depression, and in 1906 the Natal government decided to ease their financial problems by imposing a new head tax on all unmarried African males. This latest financial burden was called poll tax. Although it was highly resented, most Africans made arrangements to pay. But there were spontaneous, small-scale protests. However small, these protests were not tolerated. In February 1906, a brigade of armed policemen were sent into the Richmond area to investigate complaints that a group of Africans was resisting the collection of poll tax. A skirmish ensued. A number of Africans and the police chief were killed.
The reaction on the part of the settlers was extreme. Troops were mobilized. They were sent first to Richmond. Men were captured, including the leader of this group. There was drumhead court-martials. Men were shot.
28 members of the group were brought before a military court in Richmond. 8 received long sentences and floggings. 12 were sentenced to death by firing squad.
This was revenge. There was no rationality, reasonableness, let alone justice in this. And of course, the Battle of Kuhlonishwana is crucial in this. This was the battle where the people of Pietermaritzburg and Durban and throughout Natal panicked. The Zulus were coming, and it's in living memory by 1906.
On the night of 4th of April 1906, Chief Bambata attacked the column of 150 armed policemen marching from the executions in Richmond to Greytown, and the Zulu rebellion began in earnest.
Now, with their blood up, the Natal troops moved in. Inexcusable atrocities took place. Africans were not sufficiently armed to face at least a force which used field artillery, shells into the Nkandla forest, for example, which used the Gatling gun and also used what were called dum-dum bullets, bullets which exploded or fragmented under impact and did terrible injury. Many of the people had experience in the Anglo-Boer War, and also in the documents, in the letters, an extremely disturbing and unpleasant enthusiasm for killing. Thousands of Africans were killed. Indefensible, in my opinion.
Bambata was reportedly killed at the Mome massacre. His head was cut off and brought back to the camp for identification. Although the identity was initially confirmed, it became apparent that this might in fact not have been Bambata, but a ploy to enable him to escape. In the ensuing mop-up operations, colonial troopers photographed many severed heads in the hope that they could convince the media that theirs was in fact that of the elusive Bambata.
One thing that must be cleared up, this was not a British action. It was the action of a colonial government. The one man in London who resisted, at least in words, what Natal government was doing was the young Winston Churchill. After the killing of Bambata, he called Natal the hooligan of the British Empire. One of the problems of the settlers in Natal was their lack of awareness of what they in fact were doing and how other people saw it. This was considered to be an atrocity amongst atrocities. Can you imagine a society where people could make money out of selling pictures of severed heads?
In the aftermath, the colonial government was determined to implicate head of the Zulu royal household, King Dinizulu.
Natal settlers, Natal government was determined that somehow he was behind it, and also that he had to be brought down.
Once again, it was the family of Bishop Kalenzo who came to his aid. Working tirelessly with her sister Agnes, Harriet Kalenzo organized scores of witnesses and persuaded W.P. Schreiner, the great South African legal mind, to mount King Dinizulu's defense.
My mother had many stories about Miss Harriet Kalenzo. She used to come to the royal residence and stay there for days, and she suffered a lot of abuse because many whites, were calling him Dinizulu slut, merely because he was supporting my grandfather.
Thanks to the committed efforts of Harriet Kalenzo and the defense team, King Dinizulu was acquitted on 23 charges of high treason. Found guilty on minor charges, he was nevertheless exiled by the settler government for 4 years. In spite of white opinion during the king's trial, Sid Marwick remained a loyal ally of the Zulu royal house.
The king asked Grandad to go into exile with him when he was banished. And Grandad explained to him that he was no longer a single man and that he felt it would not be appropriate for him to either take his wife into exile or to leave her behind. And so instead of Grandad, the king then chose to go into exile accompanied by Uncle Alan Marwick, who was the man who was later resident commissioner of Swaziland.
In 1907, tragedy shook the Marwick household when Edith Marwick died soon after giving birth to their baby daughter, Vivian. In October of that year, Marwick retired from his position as Native Commissioner for the Transvaal Central Division and went into business. His firm was Marwick and Morris, recruiters of African labor to the gold mines and the Natal collieries. 9 years later, as a result of his good reputation and vast experience in African administration, in 1916, the Durban City Council appointed Marwick as the first manager of the municipality's Native Affairs Department. But for Marwick, the appointment was a poisoned chalice. At the head of Native Affairs, he found himself implementing the so-called Durban system, an oppressive colonial policy that determined the fate of the Zulu urban population in Durban. Marwick recommended that his long-standing friend from the royal household, Prince Pika Zulu, be appointed Chief Induna of the department. He recognized that Pika could play an important role in advising him on matters related to the Zulu-speaking people. In addition, as a member of the Zulu royal family, Pika would bring credibility to the department. A dehumanizing process, the Durban system was designed to restrict the presence of Africans in the Durban area, whilst at the same time ensuring the labor needs of the growing white economy. Every African man needed to acquire a passbook in order to be afforded the simple right of seeking employment in the city. Accommodated in single-sex hostels, African men were reduced to units of labor, with little regard for their humanity or well-being. Ironically, Marwick's epithet, Umuhle, the good one, rubbed off on the process he was administering, and the offices from where the notorious Durban system was administered became known throughout the country as KwaMuhle, the place of the good one. This irony was not lost on John Dube, who was emerging as one of a number of leading black intellectuals of the time. From a mission school background, educated in the USA, where he was strongly influenced by Booker T. Washington, on his return to South Africa, Dube established a number of educational institutions for blacks to promote self-upliftment. He also started the Ilanga Lassa Natal newspaper. After an altercation with Umuhle in the 8th of March 1918 edition, Dube wrote an editorial where he dubbed Marwick Umubi, meaning the bad one. Marwick was deeply offended by Dube's remarks and sued for defamation. He won the lawsuit, and Dube was left with damages amounting to some £900. In 1920, Sid Marwick resigned from the Durban municipality's Native Affairs Department and entered Parliament to become the MP for Ilovo in the ruling South African Party. With the fall of the South African Party in 1924 and the election of the pact government under Hertzog, Marwick became one of the most active and vocal members of the opposition, renowned for his skilled and tenacious debating ability. On the 26th of January 1948, after 28 years in Parliament, J.S. Marwick, then MP for Pinetown, announced his resignation from the South African Party in protest against the repeal of all legislation providing for African representation in Parliament.
He felt these were iniquitous and deleterious backward steps, that the hope for South Africa was to build a strong multiracial middle class of people who were educated and who could participate in the government and represent all views.
On the 30th of October 1951, in honour of his service to the province of Natal, the freeway through his old constituency of Pinetown was named the J.S. Marwick Highway. At Umuhle, the place of the good one, history records Marwick as a paternalist, which translates loosely as one who limits the freedom of his subjects by well-meant regulations.
I think, however, that my grandfather was far less paternalistic than most of his contemporaries. He said to me right at the end of his life when he was dying, "I die a disappointed man." He said, "I have spent my life trying to improve the lot of the native peoples of South Africa. And as I lie here dying, they are in a worse situation than they have ever been in. And the future is very bleak for them." So he was very sad right at the end of his life.
An important insight to the character of John Sydney Marwick may well lie in the interpretation of his self-image as reflected in the photograph taken on his arrival in Pietermaritzburg at the completion of the 10-day march. Here he is seen suited up, holding the symbols of two cultures. Relaxed, swinging freely in his right hand is a traditional ishola, a symbol of Zulu culture. In contrast, rather stiffly in the crook of his left elbow, he holds a pith helmet, a symbol of British colonial culture. A product of both these worlds, from this photograph, it appears that John Sydney Marwick could in fact possibly be more comfortable in his Zulu world than he is with the culture of the colonial British regime which he is seen to represent. On the 18th of April 1958, John Sydney Marwick passed away on his farm Ile at Umlaas Road, Natal. On his gravestone at Mountain Rise Cemetery outside Pietermaritzburg is the inscription, Umuhle, a life of service given to Natal.
It was quite incredible that within 2 days of his death, there were Zulu people sitting quietly with their heads bowed all around the farmhouse, and some of them had walked for hundreds of miles to be with us and to accompany us to Grandad's burial. And they started walking before sunrise, so that by the time we got to the cemetery, the whole hillside was covered with people standing quietly. My grandfather was well in his 80s when he died. One would have thought that they might have forgotten him.
Mr. Marwick did a lot of good things that he did for the Zulu people. I mean, there may have been some weak spots because as human beings we're not perfect. But by and large, on the whole, for that time, I think that he did some good things, and the Zulu people rightly regarded him as a good man. And it's not surprising, therefore, that they would have come in their thousands to pay tribute to such a man.